Hello and welcome back. This is going to be the lecture video for chapter 24. Chapter 24 and 25 is what we're covering this week. So this first chapter is going to be covering invertebrates, and chapter 25 is going to be covering vertebrates. There's a little bit of transition there between chapter 24 and 25. So we're going to first talk about invertebrates in this chapter. Let's get started. So we're going to focus for these two chapters talking about animals. So coming off of chapter 19, you learned about classification, and we had our three domains, right? We had bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And then I said we're going to focus primarily on eukarya for this class. So of the eukarya, if you remember, we had four kingdoms: animals, plants, fungi, and protists. So this chapter and the next one, so vertebrates, in invertebrates cover the animal kingdom. So of this animal kingdom, then we're going to start digging into some of those lower taxonomic classifications like phylum. So that's kind of the level that we're at right now. So domain, kingdom, animals, phylum, and a whole bunch of different kinds of phylum. But because these are all under the same kingdom as animals, let's take a look at some of their similar characteristics that puts them all together in this group of animals. Why are they not plants, fungi, and protists? So one, they're eukaryotic. That puts us in the eukarya domain. They are multicellular. That's going to separate an animal from, say, a single-celled amoeba. It is eukaryotic. It shares a lot of characteristics of animals, but amoebas are only single-celled, and so they cannot be considered animals. Animals have to be multicellular, which means their organism, their structure is made up of many, usually trillions of cells. These cells lack a cell wall, so that's going to differentiate animals from plants and fungi and some protists. So plants have a cellulose cell wall, fungi have a chitin cell wall. If you're going to take 103, you're going to learn more about those in that biology class. And some protists have some cell walls, like diatoms have silica cell walls, which are like glass. Animals, no cell wall. Animals are considered consumers, which means they have to ingest their nutrients. They cannot make their own food like a photosynthesizing plant or algae. Most, not all, reproduce sexually. So you're going to have two sexes, usually a male and a female representation of the reproductive organs. Usually, but again, not always, they are motile at some point in their life cycle. There are some animals that are what we call sessile. They're stuck tight. Think of like a sea anemone. As an adult, it just stays in one place, but as a larva form, before it kind of sticks to the rocks under the ocean, it might be able to move around. So it doesn't have to move around its whole life cycle, but they usually do, at least at some point. All right. They also can respond to stimuli. So one of the characteristics of being a living thing, to just be a living thing, is you need to respond to external stimuli. So animals can definitely do that. So then we're going to take a look at the classification of all of the different animal groups. And so there's some words in here that you don't know yet, but we're going to get there. So we're just going to take a look at some milestones that happened in the evolutionary path that gave us the diversity of all of these different animals. So first is tissues. We're going to learn about tissues a little bit later, actually a lot about tissues in a couple chapters. But tissues are collections of cells that work together to do a similar function. So there's some organisms that don't have that. They're just kind of random collections of cells. But most animals are going to have easily identifiable and recognizable tissues that do different functions. You might also see something called body symmetry. So symmetry, there's a couple different types. We're going to learn about that in this chapter. Radial, think of like a sea star, right, like a starfish, or bisymmetry, like bilateral symmetry, like what we are. Like we have a line of symmetry and our left and right halves look mirror image of each other. We're going to talk about something called the proteostome and the deuterostome. You don't have to understand that now at this point in the lecture, but these organisms are classified based on how these different internal parts develop embryonically. So it goes all the way down to developmental stages to start classifying things that are related, more related, and less related. So these are major branching points in the animal evolutionary tree. So you can kind of see over here, we can see where, let me get my little pen going here. So at this point, here's our common ancestor for animals. If you have no tissues, you go in that direction. So you might be like our sponges, are the only animals that don't have delineated tissues. If you have tissues, you go here, which leads you to everybody else. Then, of all of the organisms that have tissues, some might have radial symmetry, right? And some might have bilateral symmetry, right? And then you can just keep going down the line depending on, how many tissue layers you have. Do you have cuticles? Do you have a proteostome? Do you have a deuterostome? And then other physical and molecular characteristics you're looking at to start classifying organisms into these groups. So it's a great application of the material you just learned in chapter 19. So here's an example. This is a microscope picture of, looks like the stomach lining would be my guess, some kind of epithelial lining in the human body. So here we can see different tissues. Maybe I'll grab a different color since this is kind of red. Let's grab blue here. So this tissue right here that I'm going to highlight, this is one type of tissue. This is called epithelial tissue. And then this tissue right below it, let me grab a different color, maybe orange. This tissue here is a different kind of tissue. This is called connective tissue. And then down here, there's another collection of connective tissue. And then in the middle, let's do red. All of this is glandular tissue, right? So just on this one picture, we have at least 4 different types of tissue, and they each do something different. So groups of similar cells that carry out specific functions like muscle tissue, nervous tissue, epithelial tissue, glandular tissue, connective tissue like bones and cartilage. So like as I said, sponges are the only animals that lack tissue kind of organization. All the other animals have these clearly identified functional tissues. So in sponges, they might have specialized cells, but they're not organized. They can act independently of each other. All right, so let's take a look at that other kind of landmark or milestone in animal evolution is symmetry. So here's some pictures, some representations of radial symmetry and bilateral symmetry. So all animals with true tissues, again, that leaves out our sponges, have symmetrical bodies. They can be bisected or kind of cut so that they are mirror images of each other. So you can kind of get that idea of symmetrical body plans. They can either be radial or bilateral. So let's take a look at some more examples of these 2 types of body symmetry. So here's radial symmetry. You have, this looks like an anemone. You have your planes of symmetry kind of in the dark blue lines. The central axis would be the central point. They can be divided into equal parts, but by any plane that passes through the central axis, and they would be symmetrical anywhere you pass that line through the central axis. Organisms that have radial symmetry typically do not have a head. They have 2 tissue layers, 2 germ layers, I should say. These are tissue origins. So germ in biology means like to germinate, like to originate, to create. So these 2 germ layers that we'd find in radially symmetric organisms or animals, we're going to be ectoderm, ecto meaning outside, derm meaning layer. So outer layer covers the body, forms the nervous system. And then endoderm, endo meaning internal or inside layer. So this is going to be most of your lining of your hollow organs, whatever the hollow spaces inside this organism happen to be. Usually they're sessile. Sessile means like stuck in one place. They don't move around. Think of like an anemone. Or they might drift around on currents. Think of like a jellyfish. Cnidarians and ctenophores are examples of, cnidarians is like a jellyfish. A ctenophore is what's called a comb jelly. We'll see some examples of those a little bit later. Compare that to bilateral symmetry, where we have one line of symmetry and our left and right halves are going to be the mirror images of each other through the midline. They have 3 germ layers. So again, these are the germ layers are what are going to develop into all of the other tissues in the body, like muscle, nervous, epithelial, those types of things. So we have our ectoderm and endoderm, like we do in the other organisms, but we also have a mesoderm, meso meaning middle layer. So these, an organism that has a mesoderm would have this layer of germ tissue develop into your muscles, circulatory, and skeletal systems. Typically, bilaterally symmetric organisms are going to have what's called cephalization, which is you're going to have a head, right? So our radial symmetric organisms did not have a head. Bilaterally symmetric organisms do have a head. So there's some kind of collection, concentration of sensory neurons and nerves, maybe a brain, eyeballs, sensory like tongue maybe. And with this head, we now have a kind of like a front part and a back part. So they tend to move forward through their environment with the head being the leading edge of their body. So this would be things like flatworms, roundworms, arthropods, which are like insects, annelids, which are like worms, mollusks, echinoderms, and chordates. That's us. We are chordates. That means we have a backbone. We'll see that later. Chapter 25. All right, another thing that we can take a look at, one of those milestones, is body cavities. This is like your deuterostome and protostome conversation coming up. So here's a lateral view. So this is a section of a human trunk, their head and their chest and their abdomen, and we can see different cavities. We are not a solid mass. We have hollow spaces inside of our bodies that are filled with organs and juice and stuff. So we have, like, say, a dorsal body cavity contains our brain and our spinal cord. We have a ventral, which means belly side body cavity, that contains our heart and our lungs and our thoracic cavity, our guts and stuff like stomach, intestines, urinary bladder, reproductive organs hanging out in the abdominal pelvic cavity. So bilaterally symmetric organisms tend to have body cavities. They serve functions to support the body, protect from the outside environment, and allow different parts of the body to move independent from the body wall. So we have our pumping heart, right? Our chest doesn't necessarily move. We have our breathing lungs, and our chest moves minimally. We have all of our writhing intestines swirling around inside of our guts, and we don't really feel that, but they are moving independently of our body wall because there's a nice hollow cavity for them to do that. All right, on to kind of this development of these body cavities, whether they have them or they don't. So we get a new word called coelom, C-O-E-L-O-M, coelom. So if you are an organism that you lack a body cavity, we use a prefix A. We just put that right in front of this. Acoelomates is a word that means this organism does not have an internal body cavity. It's like totally solid from the skin all the way to your digestive tube. So here we can see an example of the blue layer is your body wall. The red layer is your or the red and the blue layer, sorry, is your body wall, and the yellow is the lining of your digestive tract. You will have a digestive tract. That's hollow, but there's no spaces outside of that, right? The digestive tract is in continual contact with the body wall. So flatworms are an example of an acoelomate. Then we have what are called pseudocoelomates. It's like, hey, I see the digestive system and there's a space around it, so it's got a coelom. I'm not moving enough, the light's turned off in my office. But it's pseudo, because pseudo means false. So this is a false body cavity. And the reason why is because there's no lining, there's no mesoderm that is surrounding the digestive tract. So roundworms are an example of pseudocoelomates. And then compare that to true coelomates, so they're just called coelomates. So they have a full body cavity, so we can see our digestive tract is surrounded by this red kind of body wall tissue, this mesoderm, and then we have the underside of our body wall is lined by this. And so this space, let me get a different color, we'll do light green. So this space here, this is that hollow space. That's our body cavity, and that allows our internal organs to move around separate from our body wall and our digestive tract. So most of our animals are going to have a true coelom. So annelids are like our segmented worms, arthropods are our insects, mollusks like clams and octopi and squids, echinoderms, sea stars, chordates, us, things with backbones. Then we have those other words in our milestone diagram a couple slides ago called proteostome and deuterostome. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this. That has lots of other kind of developmental weight to it, but we just need to know how is that coelom formed, right? So the coelom is indicated red here. You are considered a proteostome organism if your coelom is developing separate away from your digestive tract. You are considered a deuterostome in your embryonic development if your coelom can't just kind of pinched off of your existing digestive tract. So the pockets pinch off to form your coelom. So it's embryological. It's a very common differentiator in classifying animals. So that's why we talk about it. But that's about it. We're not going to go too much into more depth on that. But just know there's two different ways that coelom can be formed. Either independently of the digestive system, proteostome, or pinched off of the digestive system, deuterostome. All right, so now we're going to get into all of our different phyla of animals. Remember, domain, archaea, kingdom, animals, phyla. Now we're going to get into all of these different groups. And some of these, hopefully, you will know, or maybe some of them are your favorite kinds of animals. Who knows? So there are about 32 phyla. We're not going to cover all of those. Most of them are invertebrates, which means they do not have a backbone, right? No spine. We are vertebrates. Less than 3% of all known animals are vertebrates, which means most animals on this planet do not have a backbone. They are unlike us. They are invertebrates. So there's a table in your book, 24.1, and these are the invertebrate animals that we are going to be focusing on in this lecture. So those include sponges, cnidarians, the C is silent, flatworms, segmented worms, mollusks, arthropods, roundworms, and echinoderms. Right, so those are our invertebrates that we're going to cover in chapter 25, and then 24, and then vertebrates are going to be in chapter 25. So let's get started. So that first phyla are the sponges, called porifera. Pore meaning kind of porous because they have lots of holes. Think of like a sponge. So here's some examples. There's encrusting, there's tubular, there's vase shaped, there's all different kinds of sponges. Again, they lack true tissues. That was the only animal group that doesn't have tissues, right? Everybody else has their either, 2 or 3 germ layers of tissues. No germ layers, right? Asymmetric body plan. So they're not bilaterally or radially symmetry. They are acoelomates, so no true body cavity. They're mostly marine and aquatic, so they're going to be living in oceans. Adults are usually sessile, which means they're stuck in a place, but their larval forms can move around. The larvae land on a place, they stay put, and then they grow the rest of their lives and then release their reproductive cells into the water. So here's kind of an anatomy diagram of a sponge. So we can kind of see how water flows in, water flows out. It's going to collect food bits that way. The osculum is kind of its mouth and anus at the same time, so food bits can move in, waste products go out, water moves through, and we can kind of see how they can be structured. Different functioning cells working independently of each other, so that's not a true tissue. All right, our next phyla are called the cnidarians or cnidaria, again, silent C. These are going to be your anemones and jellyfish, and corals and hydrozoans. So you're probably most familiar with jellyfish, sea anemones, and corals. Not a lot of people know hydrozoans. So they have tissues, but they lack organs. They don't have like a heart and a lung and liver and stuff like we do. They have the 2 germ layers, so ectoderm and endoderm. They are radially symmetric, so they have that kind of circular structure. They do not have a head. They're acoelomates, right? We've defined all these things, so you can go back and look those up if you need to. Most of them are aquatic. And one of their key kind of identifying features that separates them from other things is they have stinging cells called cnidocytes. So this is like if you've ever been stung by a jellyfish or you've touched a sea anemone over at the coast, like in the tide pools. They have these little cells that send out very sharply a stinging barbed structure. So these little tentacles. And so this is showing like a little paramecium getting shot by a cnidocyte, these little stinging tentacles. So that's common in cnidaria. They can be in different body plans. So you might see a cnidarian in what's called a polyp form, where the polyp is like the sessile. So this would be like a sea anemone. The foot is anchored somewhere, and then its tentacles are kind of in the upward position and the mouth is at the top. And so they're bringing in food this way. Or you can have a medusa, which is almost like an upside down polyp, where you have the tentacles kind of hanging down. Think of jellyfish are going to be more in the medusa body plan versus the polyp body plan. Corals are also cnidarians. They're microscopic, so they grow these beautiful skeletons of like coral calcium carbonate. Think of like chalk shell material almost. And then these microscopic little polyps live in these shells, and they have their stinging tentacles to trap their food bits. So corals and coral reefs are some of those most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. They tend to form in tropical warm waters. They have these colonial big colonies that form these huge reefs that calcium carbonate skeleton. The skeleton can remain even after the polyp dies. So they can build and build and build, almost like like an empty house or an empty office building. People are no longer in there, but the structure remains. Right? The health of these is really critical. I do teach an oceanography class in the summer term if you are interested in taking another science lab class, and we learn a lot more about coral reefs and their importance in maintaining biodiverse ecosystems, as well as the threats that they are under due to lots of different factors like climate change, acidification, carbon dioxide. That stuff is happening, affecting our corals, which is kind of a bummer, huge bummer. All right, our next phylum are the flatworms, which are called Platyhelminthes. Here's a couple different examples. We got a marine flatworm, tend to be really colorful. Freshwater flatworms, kind of boring, but they're super cute. They got those little cross-eyed eyeball looking things. They're not eyeballs. Sensory organs. So they do have organs. They have a nervous system. They have the 3 true germ layers, so ecto, meso, and endoderm. They're bilaterally have bilateral symmetry, so they can cut down the midline, and your left and right halves are going to be symmetrical to each other. Their coelom is proteostome version of development. They are acoelomates. They have a distinct head with sensory organs. They lack circulatory and respiratory systems, primarily because they get their oxygen and exchange their carbon dioxide through their tissue layers, through their skin. They don't need a lung to do that. And they have a branched gastrovascular cavity. So you can kind of see that in the little critter over here, all of these little branching gastrovascular. So that's dealing with digestion as well as circulation. Some flatworms are parasitic. So here we have the life cycle of a tapeworm. So tapeworms are flatworms, they're Platyhelminthes. So you can kind of see how they have a complex life cycle. So let's say you are the consumer and you eat a piece of ham or pork meat that is undercooked. The cysts do not die because it was not heated to proper temperature. They hang out in your digestive tract. The cysts hatch. They grow into these large adult forms. They release the eggs. The eggs are shed. They go back into the pig intestine, and they go from the pig intestine into the muscle, and then you consume the undercooked meat. So it's all this big life cycle for this parasite to take your nutrients instead of finding their own. That's what a parasite does. So these are your parasitic flatworms, complex life cycles. They usually live in the body of another organism, so the host. And they have to usually go through 2 hosts. So the pig and the human are the 2 hosts for this parasitic flatworm. Liver flukes, blood flukes, tapeworms are some common Platyhelminthes flatworm parasites. The next group of worms are annelids or annelida. These are your segmented worms. So think of like an earthworm. This is going to be in that group. So they have organ systems. They have the 3 germ layers, bilateral symmetry, coelomates. They have different segments, contain identical copies of the nerves, excretory structures, and muscles. So it's like a copy, paste, copy, paste, copy, paste. So each segment has all of the information needed to control that segment. And they have a closed circulatory system. That's one of our first animal groups that actually have blood vessels that their blood-like fluid is going to be pumped through. And then their digestive system is a tubular gut with 2 openings. Now we're going to start seeing the existence of a mouth and an anus. It's basically like a tube within a tube. So here you can see some anatomical features of your typical earthworm. Here are some other examples of segmented worms. So we have what are called the oligochaetes, which are your earthworms. We have polychaetes, which we can see here in this top picture. That's a really pretty feather duster worm that's found in marine ecosystems. They have these feathery gills that kind of help their gas exchange and also trap their food. And then leeches. Leeches are also considered segmented. So they're more freshwater and terrestrial habitats. They're usually parasitic, carnivorous, or parasitic, and then they will latch onto you and suck your blood. All right, next phyla are mollusks or mollusca. These are things like octopi, squids, cuttlefish, and bivalves, like oysters and clams and things like that. They have organ systems, are 3 germ layers, bilateral asymmetry, proteostome development. They've got coeloms. They have an open circulatory system, most of them. Oops, went too fast on that one. So here's some examples of mollusks. So these are things that you might be familiar with. So gastropods, stomach, foot is basically what that means. So these are going to be things like snails and slugs. Gastropod, muscular foot. Usually they have a shell, either a large colorful shell like a snail or a reduced internal shell. They use what's called a radula, which is a scraping like tooth to scrape food off of the surface that they're kind of cruising along. A lot of them use their skin or gills for respiration, depending on which example you're looking at. Terrestrial mollusks have a simple lung because they're not surrounded by water. Again, snails and slugs. Here we have bivalves, are also mollusks. So these are going to be things like mussels that you can see here, clams, oysters, those types of things, freshwater and marine. They clamp together 2 shells, that's bivalves. They also have, they're filter feeders, and that they bring in water, filter the food, small food bits that are in that water, then pump out the extra water. They just also have a muscular foot that they use for digging into the sand to bury themselves. Usually think of like low tide, the ocean goes out. These guys, you know, dig their way down under the sand to keep moist until the tide comes back in. Scallops, oysters, mussels, and clams are some examples of bivalve mollusks. All right, then we have cephalopods, which means head foot. So cephalopods are going to be things like your octopi and nautilus that we see here in the picture. They're usually very good predators. If you've watched any videos about octopus, My Octopus Teacher on Netflix is a wonderful documentary if you like octopi. They usually have tentacles of some sort, a closed circulatory system. They're super smart, large complex brains capable of learning, highly developed sensory systems. A lot of times they can change. They are really good at camouflage. Watch an octopus or a squid change their coloration, even the texture of their bodies to blend in with their environment. Some have a shell or like an external shell like this nautilus here. Some have a reduced shell like a beak that might be more internal. Octopi, nautilus, cuttlefish, and squids are examples of our cephalopod mollusks. All right, moving on. Arthropods, arthropoda, these are like insects, spiders, scorpions, millipedes, and centipedes. Organ systems, 3 germ layers, bilateral asymmetry, proteostome development, coelomates, most abundant and diverse organisms on the planet. There are more types of insects than any other type of living thing on this planet, including bacteria so far, plants and fungi. So there's just this one phyla of animals outnumbers everybody else. They have an exoskeleton, so they do not have bones or cartilage. They're soft and squishy on the inside, and their structure comes from an outside external hard skeleton. And most of them have an open circulatory system, so no arteries and veins and a pumping heart like you think of our circulatory system. So some examples, they include insects. So that's our little Goliath beetle down here on the bottom. Arachnids, cute little spider up there on the top. Myriapods, these are your centipedes and millipedes, so the multi-legged segmented organisms. They're not insects, they're part of the arthropods. Arthropods means jointed leg. So arthropod, arthro means joint. Think of like arthritis. When you get arthritis, it hurts your joints. So arthropod is jointed foot is basically what that means. That might help you remember this group of organisms because all of their legs and appendages are jointed. And then crustaceans, think of like crabs and stuff. So when we're talking about insects, one of the groups, they typically have a body plan that has 3 distinct regions. We have the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. You may remember learning about this in earlier or other science classes. Pretty common knowledge for most people at this point. Our next phyla are called roundworms, or sometimes called nematodes or nematoda. So these are not segmented, so they are a different group than our typical like earthworms that we might see. They do have organ systems, 3 germ layers, bilateral asymmetry, proteostome, pseudocoelomates, lack circulatory and respiratory systems, Most are free living and just live in the soil. They're part of our ecological decomposers and detritivores, but some of them are parasitic. The picture that we see down here at the bottom, that is a heart being cut open, and those are going to be heartworms being removed from this particular organism. I do not know if that is a human picture, or maybe heartworms are more common in canines like dogs and stuff. So that could be removal of heartworm infestation in a dog. Moving on to our echinoderms. So echinoderms are things like sea stars and what we call starfish, but we now call them sea stars. They have tissues, they have organ systems, 3 germ layers. Their larvae is have bilateral symmetry, but their adults typically go into these. I'm not moving enough. My lights keep flicking off. Into this radial symmetry. They have deuterostome development. They have body cavities, they're coelomates. They have a primitive nervous system, but no brain, no head, because they're radially symmetrical. And they do not have a closed circulatory system. So kind of they have a water vascular system, but it's just pumping water to help them move. They're little tube feet. It's not for nutrition or gas exchange like you would think in a normal circulatory system, like in a human. So some examples of echinoderms are exclusively marine. So we see a sea fan here, we see sea urchin, sea stars, cucumbers, and sea lilies are all examples of echinoderms. All right, and then this, there are a few chordates that are invertebrate. We're gonna pack that into chapter 25. So some chordates are invertebrates, and we're gonna see that next. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye.